I'm going to introduce Steve, and then he's got a great story to tell. Most of you may already know Steve is a graduate of UCLA, lives in Seal Beach, California. In 2009, he retired from Vision Service Plan, VSP, after a 36-year career working in sales and sales management. He then began his quest to learn more about the World War II experiences of his father, pilot Howard Snyder, and the crew of the B-17 Susan Ruth. It became his passion, and after 4.5 years of dedicated research resulted in his book, Shot Down, which has received numerous book awards, at last count at least 25. A member of numerous World War II organizations, Steve is a past president of the 306th Bomb Group Historical Association. He keeps very busy making PowerPoint presentations to all types of organizations and attending air shows around the country, signing copies of his book. Steve, thank you so much for agreeing to be part of this presentation today. Turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Deb. I really appreciate and I'm honored to be a part of the reunion. I am passionate about the 8th Air Force and the air war over Europe, although my book Shot Down is centered around my father, pilot Howard Snyder, and the crew of the Susan Ruth, which was named after my oldest sister. When they went overseas, she was 1 year old at the time. The book is really about and a tribute to all the men who served in the 8th Air Force, in the mighty 8th. I am extremely fortunate and so very blessed to know so much about my father and his crew. The Shot Down story is entirely based on firsthand oral and written testimony by the people who were involved in the events that took place. My father, members of his crew that survived, 5 survived, 5 did not. One of those 5 men are buried at the Netherlands American Cemetery, and one is buried in the Ardennes American Cemetery. From relatives of the crew, members of the Belgium underground, from declassified military documents, for example, the 306 Bomb Group diary, its 4 squadron diaries, mission reports, even a rather lengthy US War Department war crimes report, and even from the German Luftwaffe pilot that shot down my dad's plane, Hans Berger, who himself was shot down at the same time by the gunners on my dad's crew. In fact, Hans is the only person in the shot down story who's still living. Just a couple of weeks ago, Hans turned 97, and I called him at his apartment in Munich and wished him a happy birthday. I've been to England 3 times, and I've been to Belgium 6 times, visiting the many locations that are mentioned in the book. I've been inside the rooms of buildings, homes, and farmhouses where my dad and other members of his crew stayed. I've attended numerous ceremonies and celebrations at memorials erected to the crew of the Susan Ruth and the liberation of Belgium. Made some dear friends in not only in Belgium, but the Netherlands and in France. 2 trips that I took after the book was written in 2016 and 2018, we did extensive filming in those countries, and it resulted in a 13-minute documentary short film that was produced, which we'd like to show you now.
Like most World War II veterans, my dad didn't talk a lot about the war. Growing up, I knew the basics. I knew he was a B-17 pilot. His plane was named the Susan Ruth. He flew bombing missions over occupied Europe. And on February 8th of 1944, his plane was shot down. I had a wonderful relationship with my father. He was a tough guy, you know, kind of a no-nonsense guy. We compared him to John Wayne. He was that type of character. My parents grew up in an area with tough times. They went through the Depression, and they were tough people as a result of that. World War II came along, and there was no other event in history that affected more people. When Japan bombed Pearl Harbor on December 7th, the country rallied. They believed in their cause, and they were willing to sacrifice all to achieve victory. Flying combat was incredibly dangerous. The average number of missions flown before being shot down was 6. For these guys to keep going up, you know, on mission after mission, knowing that the next one could be their last, took a lot of bravery and a lot of guts.
I got shot down on my 8th mission. I was up in the air and 2 fog poles came in and just shot the heck out of us. They came in about 1 o'clock. They just made one pass and everything blew up. 2 of my men were killed in the plane. 2 evaded capture. I was one of them, and my tail gunner was the other. And then 3 of them got down safely, but they were picked up by the Germans and they were interrogated, and then they were marched out into the woods and shot in the back of the head. 3 Belgian farmers saw the chute open, and they came running over, and they threw me a rope, pulled me up to the tree, and got me out of the tree. And one of them took me off into the woods and hid me. They were different personalities, of course. Some of them were brave, some of them were scared to death. The ones that were scared of hiding you, they'd move you pretty quick. The ones that weren't scared, I mean, you might stay there 6 weeks.
They risked not only their lives, but the lives of their family and friends. If the German secret police, the Gestapo, found out about it, they'd be arrested, tortured, and either sent to a concentration camp or shot. And some of the people that helped my dad and his other members of the crew met that fate. Word came that the Allies had landed at Normandy on June 6th, so he knew they'd be coming up through France to liberate that area. His Belgian helpers accompanied him over the Belgian border into France and joined up with a unit of the French resistance called the Maquis. They would disrupt communications, sabotage railroad lines, attack convoys, assassinate German officers. And so he fought with them for a couple months.
The very first hours of the 2nd of September 1944, few jeeps of the Reconnaissance Party of the 60th Infantry Regiment crossed the border, and there the Belgian population were waiting for the liberators. They were waiting that for 4 long years, and they saw the liberators coming in, and they were waving, they had flowers. It was very happy days for the whole people of Belgium.
Word came that there were U.S. troops in a nearby village of Trélone, France. So he walked into the village, into the town square, up to an Army major. My dad identified himself, and that ended his 7 months of missing in action. The Belgian people saw firsthand the atrocities committed by the Nazis. To this day, they are so grateful and so thankful still for the Americans coming to their rescue and liberating them from Nazi oppression.
My father, Paul Delahaye, started the Belgian American Foundation in 1984. It was for the 40th anniversary of the liberation of Belgium. The GIs who had been killed deserved the right to be honored and to receive homage from us because they gave their life for us.
Every year they have ceremonies at these various memorials that they've erected in the area on the anniversary date of those events. But the big celebrations are always on September 2nd, the anniversary date of the liberation of Belgium.
Your father came the first time in 1988. I remember him when he came the first time because we were very young. So that was the Americans. We had never seen Americans, you know, so that was a bit crazy.
In 1994, I took my first trip to Belgium with my parents. There was an event. There were hundreds of people in this hall, and we were a little late arriving. My dad walked in, and the entire place stood up and started applauding, and it was really moving. You know, they treated him like he was the president of the United States. I'll never forget it. And I got a whole new appreciation for my dad because, you know, I knew these stories, but, you know, you hear the stories, but, you know, they're not that personal to you. But when you're there and you've seen these places where the events took place, I've been in rooms where my dad was hidden. He was right here. He climbed out this window to get up on this roof. You know, the history is preserved right there.
The locals really saved my dad's life.
It's a war we fought together. He came here to liberate my country. Why wouldn't I help him?
I corresponded with them from the time I got back to the States until they died. They're wonderful people. They're brave people. I mean, they risk their life to keep you from being captured.
My parents had kept a lot of material from the war. There were two items that were really significant. One was a diary that my dad wrote while he was missing in action. And the other item were all the letters that my dad wrote to my mother during the war that she had kept. And sitting down one time, spending several hours reading these letters, and I just became fascinated with the story of my dad and his crew, and it became my passion. I just came to the conclusion that the story of my dad and his crew was so unique and so compelling that it needed to be told. People needed to hear about it, and so I decided to write a book. Shot Down focuses on one crew and what happened to each member of that crew. That it just makes for a fascinating story, one that hasn't been told. All that the U.S. military knew was that my dad's plane was shot down by two Focke-Wulf German fighters. And I just assumed that's all I'd ever know. One day, during my research, my wife Glenda said, why don't you try to find the German pilot that shot him down? But like a good husband, I did what she told me to do, and I found Hans Berger. He's 95 years old now. He lives in Munich, Germany.
Here's a picture of Hans. Well, that's pretty neat. There's your plane, your picture, and your autograph.
The young people of today, they have no idea what our life was, what the time was, what difficulties we had, and that we were not all evil Nazis, but we were people like you and me, and we just grew up in different spheres. On this 8th day of February, your father and me met, and we shot each other down.
I've been asked several times, like, well, don't you hate this guy that shot down your dad's plane? But no.
Well, good for you. It keeps...
From the very get-go, I felt a personal relationship with Hans. He was 20 years old. He was fighting for his country, just trying to do a job and trying to stay alive. And World War II was the defining moment in my father's life. Really, I think it's the defining moment for any guy's life who fought in World War II.
Yeah.
And Hans is a part of my dad's life, a part of his story. And so I had no ill feelings toward Hans, and we become friends.
Never thought that I'd meet the son of a guy I shot down.
Yeah, well, I never thought I'd meet you either.
Incredible.
I know the facts, but more want to know the why or how he felt, because I never asked him about it until it was too late.
Miss him?
Yes, I do. He was a great man. It's too bad that I didn't do all this while he was still living.
We had a deep respect for the American troops who came and helped us. We know that if they didn't, the world wouldn't be the same today. I'm trying to do now the same with my kids. So I'd like them to learn about that, and first to learn respect towards the Americans who came and did it and sacrificed for us.
I do think that we own them liberty. It's the less we can do it's tried to make sure they will never be forgotten.
As World War II fades in the memory, people lose sight of what took place, what that generation fought for. Because, you know, the old expression, if you don't learn from history, you're going to repeat it. They say that for a reason. So it gives you appreciation for your freedom and maybe a better appreciation for the people that serve, and gives a better appreciation and value for your country. So that's really one of the reasons why I do what I do, is to try to keep the memory alive.
Wow. Okay, everybody take a deep breath. I'm grabbing another box of tissues, as I just went through a full box. But Steve, it's an incredible story, and thank you so much for joining us. And I'm sure lots of people have questions, but for now, why don't you just go ahead and tell us what you want to.
Although the film is mainly about my dad, the shot down book goes into detail about what happened to each member of his crew, and about all the Belgian people who not only risked their lives trying to help them, but gave their lives trying to help them. It was on February 8th that their plane was shot down in 1944 on a mission to Frankfurt, Germany, where the Susan Ruth dropped its bomb successfully, but the bomb bay doors got hit by anti-aircraft fire, flak, and they couldn't get the doors back up. And as a result, that caused a drag on the plane. They lost airspeed, and they fell behind the bomber formation heading back to England. And they became easy prey for those two Focke-Wulf fighters. Two of my dad's crew members were killed in the plane. Of the other 8 men who were able to bail out, 3 became POWs. 2 were so severely injured that they were repatriated back to the United States in early 1945 before the war ended. And the 3rd man endured the grueling 86-day Black March. 3 of the men evaded capture for 2.5 months, and then were caught along with 5 other downed U.S. airmen who were all hiding, trying to get out through escape routes, and then brutally and tragically murdered. And then the last 2 members, my dad and the tail gunner, although they were separate, they both evaded capture. After my dad bailed out, he came down in some trees right at the French-Belgian border, and his parachute got tangled up in the branches, and he was dangling 20 feet off the ground and couldn't get down. But fortunately for him, some young Belgian men, Henri Franken and Raymond Dervan, came to his rescue before the German patrols arrived. And after that, he was moved from place to place to place. How long he stayed at any given location depended on how brave the people were who lived there and how dangerous the Belgium underground thought it was for him to stay there. It might be 1 night, it might be 6 weeks. When the underground in the Nazi-occupied countries of the Netherlands, Belgium, and France came across downed airmen, they tried to get them back to England through various escape routes, the most famous being the Comet Line. You go down through France, over the Pyrenees Mountains into Spain, and then out through British controlled Gibraltar. But something always went wrong trying to get my dad out. And he became very frustrated. It was a very stressful situation for him. And there were several instances where he was almost discovered by the Gestapo. And those harrowing experiences are described in the book. Finally, he got tired of hiding. News came that the Allies landed at Normandy on June 6th, D-Day. And he decided to get back in the fight and join the French resistance to fight against the Germans. It was an extremely dangerous thing to do. The smart thing to do probably was just to stay hunkered down and hidden and wait for the US armies to come up through France after D-Day. But unlike most airmen, before my dad went into the Air Force, before he volunteered for the Air Force, he was in the Army for a year. So he was trained as an infantryman and knew how to fight on the ground. Riding bicycles, Amy Cools, one of his helpers, escorted my dad across the border from Belgium into France, and he hooked up with a unit of the French resistance. The French resistance was referred to as the Maquis or the Maquis, and they were made up of small, independent, ragtag guerrilla groups spread all across France. The group my dad joined was made up of about 20 men. There were some Belgians, some French, some Algerians, and they were led by a French lieutenant who had escaped from a German prisoner of war camp. And so he fought with them for a while, and I have a couple of mementos that he brought home with him. One was as a Spanish llama handgun that he used when he was fighting with the resistance, and the other is a belt that he took off Waffen SS tank sergeant in one of their encounters. And then there was a number of encounters that his Maquis group did have with the Germans that are outlined in the book. Pretty exciting stuff. Finally, on September 2nd, 7 long months after missing in action, word came that there were US troops in a nearby village of Trélon, France. So he went into the village and identified himself. Actually, it was a unit of Patton's Third Army, which had come out through France after D-Day. And after they were interrogated him, he hitched a ride on a convoy taking German prisoners to Paris, and then hopped on a C-47 to go back to England and his 306 bomb group base at Thurley. And there he sent a Western Union telegram to my mother saying he was fit as a fiddle and to bank the money, honey, because he had all that back pay coming from all those months. My dad never forgot those Belgian people that helped him. He owed them a great debt, and like the film said, he stayed in touch with them after the war. My dad joined the Air Force's Escape and Evasion Society, AFES, which was whose members were either men who escaped capture or evaded capture, and also citizens from the Nazi-occupied countries who helped down airmen. In fact, the last trip my dad ever took was to an AFES reunion in 2004. I accompanied him to visit Valley Forge and to visit the World War II Museum in Washington, D.C. He wanted to see it before he died. And he died 3 years later in 2007. He wasn't the last crew member to die, but he was the oldest at 91. There was no other event in history that affected more people than World War II. 60 million people died. Millions more were wounded. Millions more were left homeless and displaced. It changed the course of America and the world forever. And the brave young men who fought and died for freedom are without doubt the greatest generation. Their sacrifice must never be forgotten. It's our duty to remember. Thank you.
Wow. Okay. Steve, is there any other maybe points you can make out? For one thing, you and I have been friends for a very long time now, and I treasure that friendship, and we've had a chance to talk and all. There were so many people that were involved in World War II, involved in the 8th Air Force, in all of the different bomber groups, fighter groups, whatever. And so each one of them has a unique story. And I think you've proven that in showing this. Stories may be similar, but they are never the same. Is there one point, our other two authors have offered a couple of ideas. It is kind of late in the game for us, but maybe our sons and daughters who might want to remember their grandfathers for what they did. Have you got any points of wisdom there to share?
Well, it is true and frustrating that there is a lack of appreciation with younger generations because they just don't know and haven't been educated and taught about what those men went through. And that's why I do what I do, going to these air shows and making presentations to educate the general public about it, especially younger generations, about the importance of remembering. They were a special breed of men, and the U.S. and the world was a totally different place back then. You know, trying to get across and express to the high school kids today that these guys that did this, you know, and found themselves halfway around the world all of a sudden, fighting in a war were the same age as these young people are today. So it's definitely a challenge, but it's one that we have to keep at and try to succeed.
Absolutely. Well, we did have another question from someone who wants to know, my gosh, you found the German pilot who shot your dad and the crew down. How on earth did you do that?
As I mentioned in the film, it was all I owe it all to my wife Glenda, because I thought it would be impossible. I didn't even dawn on me to try, but because of her comments, I went on the internet and Googled trying to find a Luftwaffe pilot, and a couple forums came up, which I joined, and then I posted inquiries on the forums because I knew the day he was shot down, the time of day he was shot down, the location that he was shot down. And in a week, two guys got back to me, one from England and one from Belgium. And I found out on that day there were 12 B-17 shot down, and the one shot down south of Chimay, Belgium, was shot down by Hans Berger. And fortunately for me, Hans became a translator after the war, so he speaks perfect English. And then I found out that the gunners on my dad's plane shot Hans down at the same time, which I had, no clue. So that was an amazing experience, incredibly fortunate, and I was so excited when I found him. And when I was interviewing him for the book, and he gave me some wonderful information about what it's like to go up against the 8th Air Force that's in the book. I just was bombarding him with questions. And one day he said, Steve, you're really kind of asking me a lot of personal questions, and we don't know each other very well. But I built up his trust, and over time, and as I mentioned in the film, we became friends, and I visited him twice in Munich, Germany. The last time was just last October in 2019. And so it was an amazing thing. It's one of the highlights of my life, I guess.
That's incredible. Absolutely incredible. How can people get a copy of Shot Down? And I'm not parting with my special copy of Shot Down. So how can they get their own copy of Shot Down?
Which, as was mentioned, most people buy books on Amazon, but if someone wants, again, a signed copy, they can go to my website, stevesnyderauthor.com. Snyder is S-N-Y-D-E-R. And I encourage people to go to my website, whether you want to buy a book or not, because there's a ton of information about the 8th Air Force, the air war over Europe, interviews with veterans, archival footage, all the old episodes of 12 O'Clock High TV show are on there.
Wow.
There's a wealth of information on my website.
Well, we will do that. We will get all that information posted. We'll post it to Facebook on our 8th Air Force Historical Society